Good evening, everyone. We're here to talk about the history of Israel, Gaza, and Hamas. So, light, airy subjects. When I think about the situation with Israel and Gaza, whether it's today or 5 years ago or 50 years ago, I'm reminded of something that Thomas Jefferson supposedly said about American slavery. He said that the institution of slavery and dealing with it is like holding a wolf by the ears. You don't feel particularly comfortable where you are, but you dare not let it go. And that's a little bit what Israel has to deal with Gaza, and vice versa for that matter, that the status quo, even if it's calm, feels dangerous. And the reality of the conflict is always going to be there, and it can always break loose and turn into something disastrous. Now, we want to start by talking about the history of Gaza, which goes back long before even the Jews, for that matter, but certainly before modern Israel and the Palestinians. So what I'm going to do is share my screen with a couple of maps that will help us get a picture of where we're talking about. So here on the left, you'll see a map of the general region of the Middle East. You'll see Israel is the small country there right at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. You'll see a little larger white blob in the middle. That's the so-called West Bank, or what Israel calls Judea and Samaria. And then there's a little white dot. And if you had really good eyes, you could read the little tiny print that said Gaza Strip. It's basically the line, the little white line between Egypt on one side and Israel on the other. Or if you look at the map on the right, which shows a topographical, climate-style map, you'll see that little red rectangle at the southwest corner of Israel. That's the Gaza Strip. Right next to the Sinai Peninsula, which belongs to Egypt, and very close to going up the Fertile Coast to Ashkelon, and then ultimately to Tel Aviv, and then Haifa further north. Now, what you'll notice from the topographical map is that the territory of Gaza is actually relatively fertile. It's close to sea level, which means it gets sea air, watered, and so on, which isn't always good for crops, but certainly is more likely to be the case in that desert area up in the mountains and the highlands. And this coastal plain has historically been a very fertile area, both for raising animals and for raising crops, and with access to the sea, maritime trade, and harvesting fish. Now, you'll notice if you look at the big map, that the land of Israel, and thus the Gaza Strip as a part of that historic territory, is in the middle between the two major areas for empire in the ancient world. You have on the east, the territory called Mesopotamia, or the land between the Poto, the water, Potoi, I think. That's Iraq. That was the heartland of the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Parthian Empire. And then in the west end of this map, you'll see the Nile Delta and the Nile River in Egypt. Now, when you have a lot of water, as you do in Mesopotamia and you do in Egypt, that means you can raise a lot of food. If you can raise a lot of food, you can sustain a much larger population. If you have a larger population, you can have a large army. And so those were the two centers of power, Mesopotamia and Egypt, historically, because they could sustain the larger populations. They could support culture because they had agricultural surplus. Everyone didn't have to only raise food. They could have priests, they could have literature, they could have culture, and they could have armies. Now, living in the middle between two major empires and fertile areas can be a good thing. It's a trade route, right, between the two kingdoms. That means you can charge tariffs, you can raid caravans, you can set up Motel 6s or the equivalent and provide hospitality to people as they're on their travels. So it can be a good thing to be in the middle. On the other hand, of course, it can be a terrible thing to be in the middle, because guess where the armies go tromping through? Guess who they have to conquer on their way, or who they despoil on their way home after a defeat? You're always in the middle. You're always on the road from one way to the other. And that was a problem for Israel historically. You read in the Hebrew Bible all these stories of Israel getting despoiled and conquered. Well, Gaza also has faced many, many rounds of destruction from the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire periods to the medieval era. Even the Huns under one of the Khans conquered Gaza and destroyed it on their way through the Middle East. I mean, they've been destroyed many, many times. So this is the umbrella picture of this territory and where it comes from. The Egyptians conquered the territory quite a long time ago. It was a battleground between the Canaanites, who lived up that fertile coast, even into what today is Lebanon, and the Egyptians. But around the year 1200 BCE, a new people arrived that were sometimes referred to as the Sea Peoples. These are what are today are called the Philistines. The Philistines came from most likely Crete, where they were pushed out because when the Achaeans came into Greece, they pushed people that had been in Greece into Crete, and the people in Crete were pushed out by those people, and so they wound up moving to the Middle East. They set up shop in this territory. There was an area called the Pentapolis, or the area of 5 cities, that today we would consider the Gaza Strip, and Gaza was one of those major cities of the Philistines. Now, the Philistines had a particular military advantage, and that was that they had developed a new kind of metal called iron. This is the dawn of what we call the Iron Age. When we shifted from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, bronze was copper and tin put together in an alloy, and that was stronger than copper or tin by themselves. But iron required hotter forges and produced stronger metal. If you have a stronger metal, your sword beats the other person's shield, and you're going to win the battle, even if you're not as numerous as the other power. So the Philistines were a military power, and they threatened the hill country of the Hebrews. The Hebrews tended to live in that mountain ridge you can see in that kidney-shaped place called the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria. That's where the heartland of early Hebrew culture was. And so there were raids up from the coastal land into the highlands that put them in danger. You can read in the book of Judges a story of a Hebrew strongman named Samson who confronts the Philistines, that they're his major enemy. And in fact, it's one of their women, Delilah, who tricks him and ultimately seduces him, gets him to give up the secret of his hair. He's then taken down as a captive into Gaza. He's blinded. And at the end, he regains his strength and is able to destroy 1,000 Philistines in a temple by pulling down the pillars of the building. Now, it probably didn't really happen. It's like Superman. These are ancient legends. But the conflict between the Hebrew hill country people and the Canaanites versus the Philistines was a real conflict, and Gaza was sort of the heartland of that battle. As I mentioned, there were a series of destructions here. Later in the Hellenistic period, when the empire of Alexander the Great broke up into different territories ruled by his different generals, the Seleucid Empire, which was based in Syria, often fought with the Ptolemaic Empire based in Egypt. So again, you can see on the map, you've got Syria a little bit further north, and Damascus was sort of the capital of that territory. And then Egypt, again, is at the edge of Africa. So again, Gaza is living between the Seleucids in Syria and the Ptolemies in Egypt. It becomes a battleground between the two of them, and they fight back and forth over it. One conquers it, the other conquers it back. There's even a period during the Maccabean kingdom, a short-lived kingdom between about 160 BCE and about 60 BCE, around 96 BCE. So in the middle of that period, one of the Hasmonean kings is fighting with Egypt and actually conquers Gaza as well. So it fits into the Maccabee story a little bit, that there was a Maccabean conquest of this territory. Ultimately, when the Roman Empire settled everything by taking over everything, which is how the Romans made peace, they just took over everything, they decided to assign the territory of Gaza to the kingdom of Herod the Great, who was one of their sort of vassal kings. And so this province of Gaza became attached to the land of Israel as an administrative unit. And ultimately, under the Roman Empire, after Herod was gone, it was attached to the Syrian province. So you have Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Gaza. That was all one kind of administrative district. And then Egypt would have been another administrative district. So it's beginning to become rooted in the land of Israel territory. That's where it's looking for its center of gravity. The Arab conquest, when Muhammad's armies and his followers after his death sweep up out of Saudi Arabia into the north and into the Middle East itself, happens around 637. They make their way to Gaza, and the territory quickly Islamifies. It becomes converted to Islam. The Arab conquerors mix with the native peoples there. They begin to speak Arabic, and so there's been an Arabic and Muslim presence in Gaza for quite a long time. Since 637, that's coming on 1,400 years at this point. It continued to be administered under a district they called Philistine, at the time. I will point out, by the way, that the name Palestine applied to this entire territory was a Roman innovation, because after a series of revolts against Roman rule, they wanted to put down Judean nationalism, and so they decided to call it after their ancient enemy, and they named it Philistia, after the Philistines, which becomes Palestina, and then so it's not called Judea anymore in the Roman Empire, as a way to undermine Judean nationalism. That's where the name originally comes from, is from the Philistines, but there's no genetic or biological relationship directly from the ancient Philistines to the modern Palestinians. It's a geographic term more than it is an ethnic term. The vast majority of Palestinians today claim Arabic ethnic ancestry, or some kind of mixing between the native Canaanite / Philistine / whatever Hellenistic Egyptian melange had developed there, overlaid with the layer of Arabic culture and, to some extent, genes, as everybody mixed together. Under the Ottoman administration, during the Ottoman Empire, now we're talking more like the 1500s, 1600s, the Ottomans also assigned Gaza to be part of the Damascus-based province rather than connected to Egypt. And it was kept there also under the British mandate post-World War I. The British just conquered the Middle East away from the Ottoman Empire. Think of Lawrence of Arabia, that's part of that story. And they were given a mandate by the League of Nations after World War I to administer the territory of what they called Palestine. They had made a promise to the Jews to help develop it as a Jewish homeland. They had made a promise to King Faisal for it to be an Arab kingdom, and they had made a promise with the French to secretly divide the territory that they'd conquered between the British and the French as spheres of influence, they called them, but really they were colonies. So that's why Lebanon and Syria were under the control of the French. So you imagine an east-west line there, Lebanon and Syria to the north, those were under the control of the French, and Israel and Jordan were under control of the British. I will point out that Jordan wasn't actually a separate kingdom until the British made it so. It was part of historic Palestine. You can even see old maps of Palestine that had both the West Bank and the East Bank. It's called the West Bank because it's on the west side of the River Jordan. The east side of the River Jordan was the East Bank, but they were all part of Palestine. And it wasn't until the 1920s that the British chopped off the East Bank, created a new kingdom called Jordan that they could give to King Faisal to fulfill the promise to him to get an Arab kingdom. It wasn't Palestine, it wasn't Judea, it wasn't Jerusalem, it wasn't the Dome of the Rock, but it was a kingdom. And the line of King Faisal still rules there to this day, the Hussein family. So you have this territory of the land of Israel that is part of the British mandate that they're to administer, but after World War II, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the manpower, and they didn't have the will to keep fighting with the people who didn't want them there anymore. Here you can see again this map of the full territory as it used to be, and then Jordan carved off in the 1920s. You'll notice 1920 to 22, it was part of the mandate, and then 22, it's carved off and made into its own kingdom. All right. So after World War II, the British say, we quit, we're leaving. The new United Nations says, we can solve this problem. Let's cut the country in half. And we'll make two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. This worked so well in India with the partition of Pakistan and India, and a million people dying and dislocated and whatever. Let's try it again. Although it's actually happening simultaneously to the Indian partition in 47. They're going to do it again. So you can see the proposed map from 1947, which has the yellow marked as a potential Jewish state, the orange marked as a potential, yellow is a potential Arab state, orange is the potential Jewish state, and Jerusalem designated as administered by the United Nations as an international city that belongs to nobody. Good luck, right? They can't even manage their property on the East River in Manhattan, let alone administer a city that's so, politically laden here. Also, of course, this map is totally unrealistic. I mean, even if they got along, it'd be tricky to run with all these little corners and gaps and things, let alone if they're in conflict with each other. It's not like the four corners in the Western United States where you could lie down, and put your arms in all the states. And that's not this kind of territory here. But you'll notice that the territory that today is called the Gaza Strip was designated to be part of the Arab state, because there was a substantial Arab population there, and basically not many Jews living in that general area. So the plan was to split the country in two and to have an Arab state and a Jewish state, and Gaza would have been part of that Palestinian state. Now, in 1948 and 49, there was what the Israelis call the War of Independence, and what Palestinians call the Nakba, the disaster, the catastrophe. The end result of that was the state of Israel was envisioned originally. You'll notice if you look at the population numbers, the plan for the Jewish state was to have 538,000 Jews and 397,000 Arabs. So it would have been maybe 60% Jewish and 40% Arab, give or take. Now, the end result of the population transfers that happened after the war was that a large proportion of Palestinians in territory that was supposed to be the Jewish state, or that became the Jewish state after the war, left. And the ongoing debate is, did they choose to leave to get out of the way of the armies and then come back as conquerors? Or were they pushed out? Or were they just trying to avoid war? And they fled, taking their keys with them, expecting to come back. Just like when you leave to go to work in the morning, you expect to come back and be able to get in your house. Or if there were a disaster and you evacuated to avoid the disaster, you would expect to come back to your house. So really, the truth is all three. There are instances where the Israeli army and militias pushed Arabs out of their towns and villages and agricultural settlements. There were times that they left voluntarily, expecting to come back as conquering heroes. And there were times they simply fled as civilians flee a war zone, but they expected to come back. The end result of this, though, was a Jewish state that was 80% Jewish and 20% Arab. In fact, initially after the war, I think it was 90% Jewish and 10% Arab. Well, if you want to have a Jewish state, it's a lot easier if it's 90% Jewish than if it's 60% Jewish. Plus, there was a lot of fear of what would these people bring back. So Israel did not want to allow Palestinian refugees to come back to their territory. And so they said, no, you can't come back. Now, the territories where the refugees fled to, they didn't necessarily want to welcome them either. Many of these were poor peasants. They weren't going to add anything to the society. And so they wound up staying in refugee camps for quite a long time. And notice those two territories, the yellows. Let's take a look at the map after the war. So if you look on the right here, I'll move the image screen so you can see. This is Israel after the armistice agreement. You'll notice the Jewish state or Israeli territory has expanded quite a bit from the proposed partition. They were able to take those little tiny pinch points and expand them a bit to gain more territory. That did also mean they gained some Arab population, or areas that had Arab population in the north, in the Galilee, in the south, around Gaza, and in the east, as part of what had been thought to be the Palestinian nascent state. So what happened to the green and the blue? These areas that were designated for a Palestinian state, they were taken over by the larger powers next door. So Jordan took over what today we call the West Bank, that green kidney-shaped space. And the blue, the Gaza Strip, was taken over by Egypt. Now, Egypt did not have any interest in forming a Palestinian state. Jordan did not have any interest in forming a Palestinian state. They treated the population with a kind of benign neglect / authoritarian rule. They were not incorporated as voting citizens. They were not given Egyptian or Jordanian citizenship. They had direct military rule over them, but sometimes they could study in Egyptian universities. They could work in Egyptian agriculture or industry and construction, those kind of things. So they were part of the economy of that territory, but not welcome as full citizens. The Gaza Strip population actually grew quite a bit as a result of the war. There were about 70,000 residents in the Gaza Strip on the dawn of the Nakba / Israeli independence. After the war, there were about 200,000 residents, so it tripled in size. And a lot of those residents wound up staying in these refugee camps. The United Nations set up a refugee welfare agency known by its acronym UNRWA, or UNRWA, You'll sometimes hear that. They set up the Special Refugee Agency to care for Palestinian refugees because there were refugees in Lebanon in the north, in Syria in the northeast, in Jordan, both in Jordan proper and in the Green Territory called the West Bank. There were refugee camps there, even near Jerusalem, and of course refugee camps in Gaza. Again, they weren't settled in necessarily. They were put in these refugee camps to be provided food and education and healthcare by the United Nations in what was thought to be a temporary arrangement. If you do the math between 1948 and 2023, it's been 75 years of this temporary arrangement, which itself is, a kind of problem. As we'll see, living in limbo is not something sustainable forever. Now, one of the other problems that was produced by the Gaza Strip, because you had this sort of subordinate population there that didn't have full rights, they were resentful of the Egyptians, but also resentful of the Israelis they saw across the fence who were living in what had been their land and sometimes in their houses and farming their fields and so on. And so an institution developed called the Fedayeen. The Fedayeen were like the freedom fighters. They were the cross-border raiders. They would go across and steal some food, or they would burn something down or fire some shots. And so then the Israeli army would do reprisal raids to try to punish them, to disincentivize them to do this. And again, of course, that creates martyrs that then leads to more violence. And it was a back and forth battle, but never on the scale of a full war. It was like low-level insurgency conflict, but didn't, make any friends between the two. Today, by the way, in Gaza, from that 140,000 or so refugees that were there in 1948, today they count 1.6 million refugees and their children and descendants who still have the classification of refugee because they are from that or still live in those refugee camps. I'll also point out that blue territory border is actually an armistice line. It was not an official treaty line setting the border between two countries until the Camp David Accord settled this in the 1980s. So from 49 until I think 79 or 80 when the accords were signed, it was sort of a limbo, just an armistice line, not a full border. That wasn't set. In fact, the border in Syria and the border in Lebanon are also still armistice lines, not fully set borders. Now, in 1967, the Six-Day War saw a much greater conquest by Israel. They conquered not only Gaza, but also the full Sinai Peninsula itself. And even if they gave back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in the Camp David Accord some 10 or 15 years later, they still held on to Gaza. When they took over Gaza in 1967, there were about 394,000 Gazans. So the population had basically doubled from 48 to 67. In 20 years, the population had doubled. Between UN healthcare and food and some Egyptian support, it had been moderately successful. And still in 1967, about 60% of the population was considered refugees or their descendants. When Israel took over Gaza in 67, they instituted military governance, just as they had for the West Bank, and just as they had, by the way, for Arab citizens of Israel until 1965 or so. So for the first 18 years of the state, even Arab citizens of Israel lived under military governance, not civilian. The challenge now was the border with Egypt was hostile. They just fought a war. Plus, remember, the border with Egypt is the Suez Canal, all the way on the other side of it. So where are Gazans supposed to make a living? Right? They're not going to go work in Egypt anymore. They're not going to go to college in Egypt. So what they wound up doing was coming to work in Israel, largely. They could have developed native industries in Gaza, but Israel actually liked the idea of having them come to work, as Arabs from the West Bank also came into Israel proper to work. They worked in construction, they worked in agriculture, they worked in the service economy. You might have heard or noticed that some of the captives that were taken in the raid on October 7th were Thai workers, people from Thailand. And you think, what are people from Thailand doing working on kibbutzim farms in, or as home health aides in Israel? Well, the answer is that because of the conflicts between Israel and Hamas and Israel and Gaza, they no longer use Palestinian labor to do this. They import foreign workers instead from Thailand and from other places. This is an expression, like an evidence piece of how things have changed. It's from 67 to about 87. Those jobs would have been covered by Palestinians, and there were still Gazans who were coming out and doing this work. Unfortunately, some of the reconnaissance that was done in advance of the raid on October 7th was probably done by some of those workers that were coming out. That's why they knew so well where things were located and where the security systems were, because they had seen it coming in and out as workers. And it's also going to be a tragedy because after this war, there is no way those territories and those cities and those people would countenance having Gazans come in to work for them again. At least not for a long time. So what their economy is going to be afterwards, who knows? So initially, from 67 to about 87, it worked to have the Palestinians come and work in Jewish settlements. And sometimes, by the way, they didn't even have to leave Gaza, because Israel began setting up settlements in the new territory it had conquered, in the Sinai and even in Gaza itself. There were some half a dozen to a dozen settlements there. About 9,000 Israelis lived there at the peak. And sometimes those settlements were a point of tension with who gets priority on water and development. You can imagine the same thing in the West Bank was happening in Gaza. Now, where things changed was in 1987, 20 years after the Six-Day War, because the spark that let things off was an Israeli truck ran into a car carrying Palestinian laborers and killed 4 of them. And this led to an uprising. The word for uprising in Arabic is intifada.
Was it intentional?
The Palestinians either thought it was intentional or an example of negligence, like they just didn't care. They were indifferent. It was one more expression of Israeli domination of Palestinian labor. From the Israeli point of view, I don't think it was intentional, but sometimes this is how history changes. It's an accidental thing. Supposedly, Archduke Francis Ferdinand was only shot because the car took a wrong turn down the wrong alley and happened to run into the assassins who had missed him. And it's quirky how these things happen, and then the whole world changes. So coming to the Intifada is when we can start talking a little bit more about Hamas, because Hamas started during that Intifada in the mid-1980s. Now, there had been roots for Hamas earlier because it's an offshoot of what's called the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is based in Egypt. It was founded in 1928, and it's an Islamic fundamentalist movement. But not just Islamic fundamentalists, it's anti-Western. It's anti-collaborationist. That is, they're willing to not only condemn the outsiders who are oppressing Muslims, they'll condemn the insider Muslims who are turncoats and are collaborating with the outside world, the takfiri, the heretics, the apostates, the infidels from within. And they see the current states that are nominally Islamic not being run a sufficiently Islamic way. They want a much more fundamentalist approach. Ironically, one of the sort of second generation of Muslim Brotherhood leaders, a man named Sayyid Qutb, had studied at, I think, the University of Denver, the University of Colorado in Boulder as an engineer, some kind of scientific pursuit. And the liberal permissiveness he saw there with women and with cultural practices, and it just appalled him. And he decided he was going to be against everything the West had to offer. So they fought with the Egyptian government. Nasser killed Sayyid Qutb in prison because he was a threat. The Muslim Brotherhood are the ones that assassinated Nasser, the one who made peace with Israel, ultimately. Not Nasser, Sadat. Anwar Sadat was assassinated by Muslim Brotherhood gunmen because he was insufficiently Muslim and he had made peace with the infidel, with the enemy, and therefore he was a betrayer. So Hamas is coming out of that kind of a pedigree, right? Not necessarily what leads to good governance and democratic values and so on. Hamas itself is an acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement. It's a coincidence that in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew actually, the word Hamas means violence. When Noah's flood happens, it happens because God sees there's Hamas in the land. There's a violence caused by transgression of borders. So, what does Hamas do? Well, Hamas does provide social services. They want to create an Islamic society, which does include a strong social service component to it. That it means they provide food, they run charities, and they run schools. Now, lest you think a school is a purely altruistic gesture, guess what a school enables you to do? It enables you to educate the youth with your values and your curriculum and your beliefs to then have them be part of your adherence going forward. It's a way to change society, right? It's why Moms for Liberty are having all these arguments about the books in public schools. It's, whoever controls the youth controls the future. Now, Hamas also always had a militant wing. So there's the social service wing and the militant wing. And it's up to you whether you believe that those are really two separate wings or if they commingle. Because there are people who donate money to Hamas because of the soup kitchens and because of the schools they offer and because of the medical care, the clinics that they run. And so because they want to support the social service side of things. But how strict of a barrier they put in the bookkeeping department between the charity work and the military work, we don't really know. The irony about the founding of Hamas in 87 and 88 was that Israel actually didn't think it was a bad idea. Israel's major enemy in the 1980s was a different Palestinian organization called the PLO, and its major party, Fatah, which was led by Yasser Arafat, who had been involved in the Black September terrorist activities, the Munich massacre of Israeli athletes, the international hijacking of airplanes, and that was the PLO. They were largely secular. So Israel thought maybe it'll work if we have this Islamist group that is a counterweight to the PLO. It will cause the Palestinians to be divided, and maybe they'll just go and study the Quran and not get too involved in other affairs. A historic miscalculation. Hamas becoming what it is the classic example of the golem run amok, right? The Frankenstein monster that gets out of control. So what I want to do is show you the original Hamas charter. We won't read the whole thing, but we'll look at some pieces of it to give you a flavor of the ideology of the movement when it founded. There is a revised version from 2017 is the revised version. The original one is 1988. So we'll start looking at the 1988 version. Okay, so I want to jump down to Article 1 here. You have the introduction that begins with the name of the most merciful Allah. Praise be to you, Allah, to whom we resort for help, forgiveness, guidance, and support we seek. Again, it's a very religious document here. In Article 1, it says, the Islamic resistance movement's program is Islam. From it, it draws its ideas, ways of thinking, and understanding of the universe, life, and man. It resorts to it for judgment in all its conduct, and is inspired by it for guidance of its steps. Send a note to my son to tell him to walk home. Okay. So here you see that Islam is a core principle of the movement. Now, I will say, if you want to have a political negotiation with somebody, having them start by saying that Islam or Christianity or Judaism is the core of my identity does not set a good precedent for negotiating and compromise. Article 6. The Islamic resistance movement is a distinguished Palestinian movement whose allegiance is to Allah, whose way of life is Islam. It strives to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine, for under the wing of Islam, followers of all religions can coexist in security and safety, where their lives, possessions, and rights are concerned. Under the wing of Islam, under the banner of Allah. What does that mean? Well, in the Middle Ages, Jews and Christians could live under Islamic rule, but they had to accept a subordinate status. They were what were called dhimmi, or a tolerated minority. So they couldn't build their synagogues and churches too high. They couldn't ring their bells or blow their shofars too loud. Sometimes they had to wear discriminatory clothing or walk in the gutters instead of on the sidewalks, and sort of limited indignities, but they could be relatively safe and able to run their own affairs. They could use wine in their rituals, which Muslims aren't allowed to drink. So they had limited freedoms, but as a subordinate minority. That's the model for Hamas, is to live under the banner of Islam. But Islam has to be in charge. And if it's the other way around, something is wrong. Let's see, number 7. As a result of the fact that those Muslims who adhere to the way of the Islamic resistance movement spread all over the world rally for it, and its stand, strive for enhancing its struggle. It is a universal one. Notice that single line here: the injustice of next of kin is harder to bear than the smile of the Indian sword. So those Arabs and Muslims who are betraying us, who are not sufficiently Muslim, they are almost as bad, if not worse, than the others. It draws its claims back to the fighting against what they call the Zionist invaders, with the insurgents forces among Palestinians that fought against the early Zionist movement. It connects it to the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1948 war and so on. And it even quotes from a passage in the Hadith, which are the legends about Muhammad, that says, "The day of judgment will not come until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, 'O Muslims, O Abdullah,' means servant of Allah, 'there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him.' Only the Garkat tree will not do that because it's one of the trees of the Jews." Okay, fine. Look for the Garkat tree if you're hiding. But the point is that they're drawing on deep Islamic tradition to say that the infidels, which include the Jews, will be destroyed. And they're not really differentiating here between Zionists and Jews in this particular passage. As much as they say it's the Zionist entity, you can live under the banner of Islam, but I'm going to quote this passage that suggests we're going to get rid of all the Jews. Article 8 says, again, Allah is its target, the Prophet is its model, the Quran is constitution, jihad is its path, and death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of its wishes. Again, pretty hard to argue with that, or at least negotiate with that. Article 11, it describes the land of Palestine as an Islamic Waqf, a divinely ordained territory, consecrated for future Muslim generations until Judgment Day. It or any part of it should not be squandered. It or any part of it should not be given up. So when Hamas says from the river to the sea, it's a religious obligation. They see it as, ironically, a promised land, just as the Jewish religious settlers see it as a promised land. It is part of what they believe is the divine plan for the universe and for the territories until Judgment Day. Yes, going back to the founding of the Islamic empires. Article 13. Initiatives and so-called peaceful solutions in international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic. So any kind of so-called peaceful solution is in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. Abusing any part of Palestine is abuse directed against part of religion. Nationalism of the Islamic resistance movement is part of its religion. And now and then the call goes out for an international conference to solve the Palestinian question. Some reject it. It's useless. When did the infidels ever do justice to the believers? There is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals, international conferences are a waste of time and vain endeavors. So why bother talking? It's useless. Now, you might think this is just, militant nationalism here, but you'll see how the European poison of anti-Semitism has made its way into the Middle East in some of the later articles. For a long time, in Article 22, the enemies have been planning skillfully and with precision for the achievement of what they have attained. They took into consideration the causes affecting the currents of events. They amassed great and substantive material wealth, which they devoted to the realization of their dream. With their money, they controlled the world media, new agencies, the press, broadcasting stations. With their money, they stirred revolutions to achieve their interests and reap the fruit therein. They were behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and most of the revolutions. With their money, they formed secret societies such as the Freemasons, the Rotary Clubs, the Lions, and others in different parts of the world to sabotage societies and achieve Zionist interests. With their money, they were able to control imperialistic countries and instigate them to colonize many countries to exploit their resources and spread their corruption there. They were behind World War I when they destroyed the Islamic Caliphate, making financial gains. They obtained the Balfour Declarations, formed the League of Nations through which they could rule the world. They were behind World War II, in which they made huge financial gain in training armaments and paved the way for the establishment of their state. to claim the Jews were behind World War II just to get a state. I mean, they're sort of missing a big problem in the middle of that, right?
Like facts.
Yeah, well, right. There is no war going on anywhere without having their finger in it. What does that sound like? It's the protocols of the elders of Zion. It's the global Jewish conspiracy. It's the Rothschilds. It's the Jewish space lasers. It's, it's all this stuff that we've heard before. If you jump forward even more egregiously, Article 31. The Islamic resistance movement is a humanistic movement. It will take care of human rights and is guided by Islamic tolerance regarding followers of other religions. It's possible for the followers of the three religions to coexist in peace and quiet with each other. It's not possible except under the wing of Islam. Again, Islam has to dominate. They can be subordinate. And so the Zionist Nazi activities against our people will not last for long. So you see they're sort of throwing them under the condemning bus. And then Article 32 is perhaps the most egregious. World Zionism, together with the imperialistic powers, try through a studied plan and intelligent strategy to remove one Arab state after another from the circle of struggle against Zionism, making these separate pieces with Egypt and then trying with Jordan and then trying with someone else, removing them through the treacherous Camp David agreement. This isn't worthy of a Nobel Peace Prize. This is the, Mohammed Memorial Betrayal Prize that Egypt has won. And then I just wanted to, the Zionist plan is limitless. After Palestine, they aspire to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates. That's all of Egypt and all of Mesopotamia. When they have digested the region they overtook, they will aspire to further expansion and so on. Their plan is embodied in the protocols of the elders of Zion, and their present conduct is the best proof of what we are saying. So we're supposed to negotiate with this group? Supposed to find common ground and, well, maybe not. Maybe not. So this is the Hamas movement that's formed in the late 1980s, puts out this charter, and begins to resist against what they consider Zionist occupation. First, directly, when Israel is directly in charge of this territory, and especially after the Oslo Peace Accords. Because the Oslo Peace Accords turn over governance of Gaza, except for the Jewish settlements that are there, to this newly formed Palestinian Authority under Yasser Arafat, just as the West Bank has certain territories given over to direct Palestinian Authority control. But the Oslo Peace Accords, as you can see, are a direct betrayal of Hamas's vision, right? It's the antithesis of what they want. And so they condemn the PLO and the Palestinian Authority and Fatah as heretics, but of course, their targets are primarily Israelis. During the Oslo Peace Accords, they initiated a series of suicide bombings, some by a group called Islamic Jihad, which is even more radical than Hamas, but many of them by Hamas itself. Their goal was to destroy the two-state solution, to destroy the peace process, because they wanted all of Palestine. Remember, every inch is a holy possession that they cannot surrender. So any kind of compromise or dividing the land was anathema to them. This intifada began in 87, but the suicide bombing didn't start till the Oslo peace process, when it was a real prospect of dividing the land. And ultimately, it undermined that, so much so that in the year 2000, there was a second intifada, sometimes called the Al-Aqsa Intifada, because it was a claim that Israel was trying to take over the Dome of the Rock. And it led to mass suicide civilian bombings. There had been episodic bus bombings in here and there in the 90s. Now it really began to take off. There was a massive bombing of a Sparrow pizzeria in downtown Jerusalem. There was a Dolphinarium nightclub on the Tel Aviv beach. There was the horrific bombing at a Passover Seder that killed 30 people and wounded 140 in Netanya, which is on the coast. Nowhere near the West Bank, by the way, well into Israel proper. And the end result of this was that Israel decided that there needed to be barriers, and this is when the Palestinian laborers coming into Israel began to be cut down and the foreign workers began to be brought in, because there was concern that it's just not safe. So when you get the beginning of the building of a security barrier along the West Bank line, although it cuts in quite a bit because it includes Israeli settlements inside that barrier, so it does not follow the what's called the Green Line or the Armistice Line from 1949. What happened in Gaza? In Gaza, something shifted in 2005. That's when Ariel Sharon, who was the former Likud right-wing nationalist general, decided to pull the settlers out. He said, there's 9,000 settlers there. We have to send 5,000 troops to guard the 9,000 settlers. It doesn't make any sense. So he pulled them out against their wishes. It was, there were these terrible scenes of people being dragged out of their homes. And the theory was, okay, Gaza, it's yours. This territory is all yours. We're not there anymore. We've fully withdrawn. This is an ongoing argument you'll get, because people will refer to Gaza as an open-air prison, because Israel controls all the access. And Israel will say, we fully withdrew from Gaza. What are you talking about? We're not in charge there. So the answer is that they both have a little bit of truth to them. There is no internal Israeli military or police presence under normal circumstances. Obviously now there are Israeli troops all over the place. But prior to October 7th, there were no Israeli troops or military police presence in Gaza itself. Israel did control the airspace over Gaza. There's no Gaza airport. They control maritime access to Gaza. They set the limit for how far Gazan fishing ships can go out, and do not allow shipping ships to make their way into Gaza ports. They control land access at 6 of the 7 land entrances. There's 1 into Egypt, and all the rest are access into Israel proper, and Israel controls the access of what comes out and also what goes in. And they always have a list of things that are not allowed in. So for a while, you couldn't bring concrete in to Gaza because Hamas had requisitioned some of it to build attack tunnels and bunkers and things. And so Israel said, fine, you don't get any concrete. Of course, if you're in the construction industry, what are you supposed to do? If people want houses, what are you supposed to do? It's like there's forests you can cut down and make, wood log cabins. So this is where it becomes a battle zone over who's in charge here or not. Also, Israel controls the water and sewage system. The electricity to Gaza was provided by Israel. The telecom service was provided by Israel. So you may have heard that these things got shut off when the war started. It was amazing for people to realize that Israel was running it in the first place. What are you doing? Why are you still running this? And there were some desalination plants. There were some local power plants that ran on diesel backup. But Israel provided a lot of the power and a lot of the water for Gaza. So was it a full withdrawal? Was it a full separation? No. And as I said, there were still Gazans coming into work in the settlements.
Why is that? I can understand why they would want to have security and like you have control what comes in and all that sort of thing. But why do they need to have control over like the water?
Well, because you can ship in missiles as easily as you can smuggle them in. If you had,
water, like water supply. I thought it was like water.
Oh, the water supply, yeah. Well, they had built it that way. They had built the water supply between 1967 and 2005 when there were Israeli settlements there and when they were in charge of the territory before they handed it over to the PA. So they had integrated it into the Israeli water system, and Egypt wanted nothing to do with it because remember, Hamas was very strong in Gaza even when the PLO was in charge nominally. And Hamas is related to the Muslim Brotherhood. Hosni Mubarak was the dictator that took over after Sadat was assassinated by the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood was illegal in Egypt until the Arab Spring. So they wanted nothing to do with Hamas. And wouldn't have provided water, so Israel was sort of stuck with it. But the other side of it is that they charged them for it. It was revenue for them. And unfortunately, this is sometimes what happened where they wouldn't encourage native Palestinian industry, but they would sell developed manufactured products made in Israel to the Palestinians in Gaza or in the West Bank. Now, what changed in Gaza was, as I mentioned, control was handed over to the Palestinian Authority in 2005 when the Israelis withdrew. But Hamas in 2006 won a plurality. They were the largest party in the Palestinian elections for the parliament. And this led to conflicts with the PLO because Arafat was still the president of the PLO and then Abbas following him. But Gaza was supposedly in charge of the parliament. And the whole PA legal basis was the Oslo Peace Accords. So when Hamas won the plurality in the parliament, Western powers said, well, if we're going to support the PA and you're in charge, you have to accept the Oslo Accords. So you have to accept the existence of the state of Israel. You have to renounce violence, and you have to endorse the Oslo Accords. And Hamas said no, no, and hell no. So they were at an impasse. In 2007, Hamas took over in Gaza. They actually literally threw off buildings and killed representatives of the PA and Fatah in Gaza proper, and they became the de facto power in charge in Gaza. Once Hamas was in charge, the smuggling through tunnels with Egypt accelerated, both of trade goods, but also of weapons and rockets. The tensions with Israel became higher, and they tolerated these more radical groups like Islamic Jihad that were even less under control than Hamas's military wings. And ultimately, this led to a series of conflicts between Hamas and Israel itself. In 2008 to 2009, there was a tunnel leading from Gaza into Israel proper that was planned to be used for an attack to capture Israeli soldiers and use that to bargain for Palestinian prisoners or something else like that. That was destroyed by Israel. This led to the launching of rockets against Israel by Hamas, which led to a brief invasion to try to knock out the rocket launcher sites. And it was the beginning of this cycle. So you have 2008 and 9, this first invasion. Again, many more Palestinians die than Israelis, but a number of Israelis die because this is before the Iron Dome exists in 2008, 2009. Iron Dome doesn't get deployed until 2011. Another round of violence takes place in 2012, where there's a series of rockets and a series of airstrikes, and people die and are scared and property is destroyed. In 2014, in the West Bank, there are 3 Israeli teens that are kidnapped and ultimately killed. This leads to several hundred West Bank Hamas activists being arrested, which leads to rockets being fired from Gaza into Israel proper. And that leads to airstrikes back, and then a brief invasion to destroy more of the tunnels. And if it sounds like a repeat, it was. It was this process. And at one point, one of the Israeli ministers used a very terrible phrase for it. He said, sometimes you have to mow the grass. You know, they build up their strength again. We got to mow them down. We're not going to wipe them out, but we got to mow them down, and then they'll make. I mean, it's terrible to think about all these people they're killing and saying it's mowing the grass. In the end, though, with the deployment of the Iron Dome rocket defense, you would have periodic clashes around the borders where they try to approach the border fence. Israel has a buffer zone around the border fence that they don't allow the Palestinians to get within a certain amount of yards of. There was launching projectiles, whether it's more rockets occasionally, or sometimes even launching balloons with incendiary objects on them to catch the fields on fire. So it's not a rocket, and you can't stop it with the Iron Dome, but it can still cause damage and is a belligerent act. But there was also, some stability in this period between 2014 and 2023. The Gulf states often contributed to the maintenance of governing affairs and social welfare services in Gaza, and Israel transmitted that money to the PA. The thought was, if we allow Hamas to function in Gaza and things are relatively quiet, we can live with this. It's like keeping the genie in the bottle, right? And we can do that indefinitely. Today, actually, these days, Netanyahu is getting flack from the right wing as well, because you gave all this money to Hamas and look what they did with it. You were trying to buy them off to keep them quiet, and look what had happened. So in the end, the long run success of bottling up Hamas has clearly failed. Given that we're already at almost an hour here, I want to just wrap up and open up for comments and questions. We won't look at the 2017 Hamas Charter, which is an interesting document to compare to the 1988 one. It's a lot more diplomatic and measured. It still has the same religious passion to it. It doesn't have anything about the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Someone got to them and said, hey, you really shouldn't include that in a public document saying who you are. And it offers the prospect of a long-term truce, which the early one has nothing like that. They can't surrender the land, but maybe they can make a truce with some kind of deal. It actually references following the pre-6 Day War borders with some foothold in Jerusalem for Palestinian capital. And so it could be the basis for some kind of dialogue. but that's the 2017 version is worth taking a look at. So we've seen what's happened since October 7th of this year. There is a strong Israeli consensus that Hamas is really the 1988 Hamas, not the 2017 possibly compromising Hamas, or the keep a genie in a bottle Hamas from 2015 to 2023 until October. That is not sustainable anymore. And so their approach is we need to wipe out Hamas, no matter the cost, to Palestinian civilians or to Gaza itself. If they have to raise every building, to wipe out every tunnel, and to catch every Hamas operative, then, oh well, that's what they'll do. You can see the results on the news. It looks like one of those bombed out cities from Europe or from Japan after the Second World War.
Instead of mowing the lawn, they're using weed killer.
Yeah, right.
Grass killer.
Right. Or they're resodding. I mean, they're taking everything out. Yeah, and people are making parallels to the post-World War II denazification process, where you had to root it out, root and branch. But of course, what made that successful in the long run was not just the destruction; it was the Marshall Plan, it was the rebuilding, it was what happens after that you had to have an answer for. And so far, we've not gotten a clear answer from Israel what they're willing to countenance for a follow-up. Is it a peacekeeping force made up of Arab countries that Israel trusts? Is it a United Nations force, United States troops? Is it Israel direct governance? Is it handing it back over to the Palestinian Authority and let them administer it? But if they come in on the heels of the Israeli invasion, how is the citizenry going to accept them as legitimate? They're going to be seen as the new collaborators. And, you've had a generation raised in these Hamas schools that's going to see them as just as bad, if not worse, than the Israelis that they're replacing. You see, the problem that Israel faces, the job 1A of every government is to keep your citizens safe. It's job 1A. Any government is to keep your citizens safe. And if that means that other citizens suffer because your citizens are not safe and are going to die, that's the calculus of war. And Israel is in a war with Hamas, and that's why they're not willing to talk about a ceasefire, because from their mind, a ceasefire lets the cancer that is Hamas come back, and the cancer that is Hamas will kill us. Not all of us, maybe, but it will kill some of us, and that is unacceptable, given what they did the last time we let them sit for 9 years and not, quote, mow the grass. We have to uproot, literally, Hamas from that territory, and so the only way they see to do it is to wipe everything out. Now, one could make the good faith argument that that's a bad idea. That's not going to work. Because how can you wipe out Hamas? It's like declaring war on terrorism. It's a strategy. It's an ideology. It's an idea. Hamas is an idea.
Not just some people.
Right. It's a movement, not just and it's not like there's a Hamas detector where you can scan someone's forehead and decide they're Hamas or not. So that's the problem, is that what's the end game? What does victory look like? When can you plant the flag, say we won, and then pull out? Well, that's unclear.
What does the dog do when it catches the car?
Yeah, when you catch the car, what do you do? Gaza right now looks like these World War II cities, these ruins. Is it a chance to rebuild and a new beginning and a new foundation, just like Chicago rebuilt after the fire and made a world-class city? Or is this just a break before the next round of more conflict, be it in 5 years, 10 years, or for the rest of our lives? So with that, I want to stop and give some time for comments or questions. Someone asked in a private message, so no one else could see it, which isn't helpful. How did Hamas acquire all of their weapons? Well, they've acquired them a few different ways. Some of them are homemade. Israel actually recently conquered part of one of the universities in Gaza, the electrical and mechanical engineering department. Guess what some of the work that was being done in the electrical and mechanical engineering department at the university? Well, it was supporting the Hamas weapons industry. So they have a native weapons industry that's developed a lot of these things. A lot of it's smuggled in from these tunnels under the Egyptian border. Sometimes maritime smuggling still happens despite Israeli monitoring of the seas. Hamas is one of the client militias of the Iranians, who want to sow discord in the world, and especially in the Middle East, and especially against the great Satan of America and its proxy, Israel. So they are funding Hezbollah in the north. They are funding Hamas, and they're happy to see Hamas make this mess. It's not a coincidence as many people have pointed out, that Israel had been talking with Saudi Arabia about some kind of normalization agreement, and Hamas said no, and we're going to prove why you're never going to do it. They at the price of the Gazans, at the price of Hamas too. They're doing what Iran wants to see, to undermine this pro-Saudi, anti-Iranian alliance, but at the cost of thousands of lives. And Iranian funding plus smuggling and other means of acquisition of weapons and making them themselves has left Hamas relatively well armed.
It seems like the best outcome would be the one that's least likely to happen, which is to say, since your intention ultimately, as the proxy for Iran, was to shut down those kinds of normalization talks between Saudi Arabia and Israel, we're going to go ahead and do it anyway, and your efforts will have failed. But I think those are now, if not completely dead, they're really out of it for a long time.
What I've heard is that the diplomats are still interested, but the population wants to hear nothing of it. Right? That while this is going on, they cannot talk to Israel about normalizing when all these Palestinians are showing up on the news dead. Whoever's fault it is, whatever legal justification, they don't care. The images are the images, and their people are dying, and so they won't countenance it. I mean, you could see that happen. It happened in Europe, by the way. When Putin invaded Ukraine, one of his stated reasons was it was getting too close to NATO. NATO was getting too strong. NATO was encroaching. Well, guess what happened? Putin invaded Ukraine, and the Nordic countries decided to join NATO because they felt at risk. And that puts Finland in NATO. That puts Norway in NATO. I mean, Sweden in NATO. They never would have done that. Or no, Norway was in NATO already, but Sweden wasn't, and Finland certainly wasn't, because it's right next to Russia. So now Russia, that was so upset about Ukraine possibly joining NATO on its border, now has many countries on its border that are hostile and are NATO members, and has made Poland even more closely connected to NATO than before. So it could be the case that it does produce that kind of backlash. Look, if you want to be, really pie in the sky optimistic, maybe this turns the Palestinians against Hamas. They see what happened. They say, well, Hamas made this happen, and it's Hamas's fault, and so, we're going to blame you for this disaster. It's possible that could happen. It's unlikely, I was hearing an interview recently with a Gazan woman who was in Israel when the conflict broke out because she had a baby that was getting a specialized heart treatment. There's a nonprofit that provides for emergency health care to babies with heart defects to be brought into Israel, have their treatment done, and then offloaded to the hospitals in Gaza for follow-up treatment and so on. But the surgery is done in Israel, and this mother and her infant were in Israel having this surgery done when everything blew up on October 7th. And so, of course, they're trapped. They can't go back. And initially, when they interviewed the woman shortly after October 7th, she said, this is so terrible. Why can't we get along? Look how generous they're being to me. A few weeks later, her family's home was destroyed. A couple of her kids were killed. She wants nothing to do with any kind of compromise, anything. She wants to get the hell out of Israel. She wants nothing to do with these people, because look what they did to her and her family. So, for people who think this might have a positive silver lining of rejecting Hamas, well, at least in the short run, you don't blame the distant cause. You blame whose name is on the bomb, what flag is on the plane. That's who killed your person, and it's very hard to see a bigger picture where you're anything other than targeted. Or, being collateral damage is not a lot of comfort.
And I wonder what kind of effect it's having on Palestinians to watch the protests all over the world in the States, in the university campuses. There are people coming out, not just in support of Palestinians, but in support of Hamas.
So this is an interesting question, because some of the people are coming out for Hamas. I mean, you get these crazy signs of queer people for Hamas, and I'm thinking they would throw you off a building. Like they want nothing to do with you.
Right. How do you not know that?
Right. But it's thinking of the world in black and white. There's the oppressed and there's the freedom fighters. And if Hamas is on the freedom fighter side, then they're all fine. And if Israel is on the oppressor side, then they're all wrong. And that's why you get people, in these odd positions. But I will say, see, some people are treating any call for a ceasefire as sympathizing with the Palestinians and Hamas, as if you're on their side, because they see the world in black and white. There are plenty of people who are advocating for a ceasefire who just want the killing to stop on both sides. And they're not doing it because of strategic considerations, and they're not doing it because they want Hamas to rebuild or to plot new bombing attacks. They're not sleeper cells. They're people who want the bombing and the killing to stop. They're reading the situation as, Hamas is part of the Palestinian street society. You can't wipe it out without killing too many people. The cost is too high. I've used the analogy, if you have 3 terrorists on an airplane with 100 passengers, you could blow up the whole plane to kill, the 3 terrorists, but most people wouldn't make that calculation. Right now, there are 240 Israeli hostages, if they're still alive, in Gaza. And right now, the army's priority is clearly kill Hamas over save the hostages. Because what they're doing is making the hostages' lives more at risk, as I analyze it. Now, they might say, this gives us leverage. If Hamas wants a ceasefire, because we've got them on the run, then maybe they'll release the hostages and we can save hostages that way. You could argue the strategy. So not everybody who puts a Palestinian flag out is a Hamas supporter, and not everybody who puts out a ceasefire call is in favor of Hamas. It's complicated. I mean, there are Jewish organizations, Jewish Voice for Peace, and other group called Not in My Name, who are calling for a ceasefire now because they want to stop the killing. And it's not because they are not sad over what happened to the Israelis. They're not the ones claiming it didn't happen. They're not the ones claiming that colonizers get what colonizers deserve. Those organizations are not saying that. There are some people who are saying that. The Democratic Socialists of America have had a real schism in their movement because some have said colonizers get what colonizers deserve. By any means necessary means by any means necessary, and whatever the oppressed do is justified. You do get some people saying that. But there are other people who have said, the people who resigned from the Democratic Socialists of America because they said, look, the whole point was we don't want violence. And this is not justified, killing these people. I think it was Naomi Wolf who said that one of the principles of socialism is, given the choice between the gun and the child, we always choose the child. No matter whose child, no matter whose gun, we choose the child. And so that attitude of the colonizer gets what the colonizer deserves is not in concert with that value. So one of the questions on the chat is the media biased against Israel because you never see on the news any damage and killing that the Hamas rockets are causing? Well, in fact, Hamas rockets are causing almost they're causing damage and destruction. Most of them are intercepted by that Iron Dome system. Its interception rate is over 90%. So even if they launch, 100 rockets, 10 of them are going to get through, and many of those land in open areas. Sometimes they don't target them. If they project it's going to land in a field, they don't waste a rocket on it. And many of the people in the at-risk areas around Gaza or in the north, where Hezbollah is, are already evacuated. So you're not having as many Israeli deaths as there are Palestinian deaths. And look, if you have 150 deaths in Gaza, and you've got 2 deaths in Israel, which is going to get more play. And the other thing that's tough for us to imagine, Palestinians and their supporters right now feel like they're the ones being oppressed. They're the ones suffering because they're getting death threats, they're getting bomb threats, they're the ones getting their student groups canceled at universities. Right now they're suing in Florida because Students for Justice for Palestine was banned from Florida campuses, and now they're suing the state government that did so on free speech, and the ACLU is supporting them. In GW, at Columbia, there are a number of pro-Palestinian groups that have been kicked off campus for the semester because they violated the rules, and so they feel like their free speech rights are being infringed on. And again, there are Arab and Islamic groups that are getting threatened. We saw that terrible case in Illinois where a mother and her child were stabbed to death, or the child was stabbed to death, the mother's in the hospital still, because the landlord was convinced they were Palestinian and therefore we're going to kill them. So the other side is also afraid, facing hatred and so on. And I've mentioned before that I was on a Zoom call to learn how to spend the grant money we were approved for building security and hired security. And a number of the other groups on the call were Arab and Muslim groups who are also facing increased expenses for building security and cameras and armed security guards to be at their events because people don't feel safe coming together in those communities either. Now, media bias, this is where it gets tricky because, of course, each side claims that it's biased for the other side. If you read Jewish media, the media is terribly biased against Israel. If you read Palestinian or Arab language media, it's horribly biased against Palestinians who are only portrayed as terrorists and terrorist sympathizers, and so the media is in a tough position. They do mess up. The bombing of that hospital, which was most likely by an errant rocket launched by a Gazan-based organization trying to target Israeli civilians. In fact, wound up hitting Palestinians instead. And this happened before in the past. There have been these wailing fires because, again, they're not professionally made. These are sometimes homemade rockets that don't.
But the retractions are like on page 33 later on, and people can see it.
The retractions show up much later. That's true. And Israel just this week posted some pictures and they had to take them down and they put them up again in a different fashion. And this is a dynamic media environment. Things are changing, and the truth is sometimes hard to discern. I have seen that even on very progressive websites like Huffington Post, they now note that the Palestinian casualty figures are given by the Hamas-run health ministry and do not differentiate between combatants and non-combatants. So when they say 11,000 Palestinians have been killed, it doesn't tell you how many of those were Hamas fighters versus civilians. So historically, though, I did see a note that in past conflicts, like some of the ones I mentioned, the Palestinian Health Authority run by Hamas, their numbers have been in the ballpark of accurate. So in the 2014 conflict, the Palestinians say there were 2,300 Palestinians that died. The UN said there were 2,200 that died. And the Israeli Defense Force said there were 2,100 that died. So that's in the ballpark, right? 10% difference. So that's not, radically by orders of magnitude off. And to be honest, it's very hard to count bodies right now. There's no cell phone signals or internet signals. They've stopped, reporting. There are bodies buried under rubble that you're not going to find for years. So this is going to be one of those cases where the casualties may be, in fact, even higher than reported. I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, just like I give benefit of the doubt to the people who want a ceasefire or the people who want humanitarian pauses, that they're not stupid and they're not naive and they're not sympathizing with the enemy. They've come to a different analysis of the cost benefits and the moral values involved. And so the same is true with the media coverage. Most media people are probably doing their best to be as accurate as possible. And they listen to both sides and they try to present as best they can. I mean, CNN has been giving a ton of coverage to what's been happening in Israel, to the casualties on the Israeli side, to they just released part of this terrible video collected from the body cameras that the Palestinians were wearing on the rampage on the 7th. They've been presenting a lot on this, and they also present stuff from Gaza talking about what's happening there. And if you watched 5 minutes, you might think they're terribly anti-Israel. And if you watch a different 5 minutes, you think they're only pro-Israel. It really runs the gamut.
I think they've been pretty good, actually. I would say all three, Fox, CNN, and MSNBC have in the latter two that are more liberal. They're not. It seems like they're not afraid to say that Hamas is a terrorist organization and they're hiding behind or under hospitals. They're hiding behind civilians.
Right.
But they also show the death and destruction of innocent civilians in the way of the bombs. Right. Yeah. So it just So both, provide all the information.
Yep.
Let the data make the case.
Right. So a couple of questions in the chat to work in. Adam asks, I've heard some extreme elements of Netanyahu's government call for reestablishment of settlements in Gaza. What's the basis for wanting to do this? Well, it's to have an on the ground, boots on the ground presence there. And so the settlements would be basically based around military bases. So you simply reoccupy Gaza. The right wing didn't want to withdraw from Gaza. They saw it as, we're the new Samsons. We're going back to Gaza, and this time we're going to take it over and stay there. And they want as much territory to be settled by Jews as possible. It's the same people that want to settle in the West Bank. They want to settle in Gaza too. There is a passage, when Hamas said from the Nile to the Euphrates, there is a passage in the Hebrew Bible that describes the ideal kingdom of Solomon and the promised land of Abraham as running from the Nile to the Euphrates. So that they could be quoting Genesis, when they said that in the Palestinian charter and the Hamas charter. So there is some biblical claim to the land if you want to read the right passages. And for some people, that's the motivation. But for some of them, it's a security thing. They felt they were safer when they had people there. And if having people live there means having soldiers there, means having a presence there, then that's a way of staying in control. And if it's all been destroyed anyways, we can rebuild it however we want. If we want to rebuild settlements there, then in theory they could do that. Question from Ellen. How did the area that is Gaza come to be thought of as a distinct area? It sounds like it's been that way for thousands of years. Is there something geographically distinct? I don't know that there's any clear barrier. As Gaza ends, the fertile land fades, and the Sinai is mostly desert. If you remember pictures from the 6 Day War or the Yom Kippur War, there's all these tanks burning in the desert. That's the Sinai. It's mostly desert. There's some fertile areas along the coast, and there's actually some beach resorts the Egyptian army has built all along the coast in the Sinai. That's part of their corruption. Interesting side note. Basically, the edge of Gaza is where that Sinai desert starts. So on the west end, there is a kind of geographic designation. On the east end, it's continuous. There isn't a river, there isn't a mountain or any other natural barrier that's there. At this point, there's a lot of cluster munitions and rocket fragments and unexploded grenades. It's a war zone. And so that's why it's left empty these days and people don't live there. One of the Palestinian complaints is that Israel built a fence on the border and then made a buffer zone inside the border. So that takes away potential Palestinian territory to build farms or houses or anything else, because now they can't even get within X amount of that fence. It's like, confiscating the land, so to speak. Israel's perspective is, well, when we let you get close to the fence, you shoot, you bomb, you mortar, you cut the fence, and then look what happens. So Israel could, in theory, put the buffer on their side, but if you're going to have a buffer zone, why not take it out of the other person's acreage? Nancy Sohn says, approximately 10 years ago, Israel released around 1,000 prisoners in exchange for one Israeli soldier who'd been kidnapped by one of these Palestinian groups. That was Gilad Shalit. Was the name of the prisoner. One of those was a Hamas member who later developed and led the October 7th raid. Is it responsible for Israel to handle kidnappings in this way? Well, this is a good question. I don't have a hard answer to it because it's a hard question. There are large numbers of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jail. Some of them are minors, under 18. Some of them are women. Some of them committed murderous crimes. Some of them are what are called in security detention, where it's a preemptive arrest, and you don't even necessarily have to bring the trial. It's like the oubliette of the French, pre-French Revolution era. And so you could release some of those prisoners and probably be fine. Some of them might turn out to be people like this, right? Israel historically has wanted to save live people. It's even given up prisoners for dead people to get the bodies back. They've put a high premium on ransoming lives, that saving captives is a preeminent duty. So the Hamas theory was that when they had all those hostages, there's a reason they took those hostages, because they felt that if we have these hostages here that are alive, that we can keep ourselves safe because they're not going to dare attack us when we have the hostages, and we can negotiate to get a release. If it's 1,000 to 1 for one person, guess how many we can release with 250 captives? Now, they also, by the way, the Palestinians didn't expect to be as successful as they were. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. It's what they call running around in the backfield, like when the defensive line breaks through the offensive line and can chase the running back and the quarterback all at the same time. That's what they were able to do because they didn't expect to get through so successfully. They hadn't planned on being there that long. So they got more captives maybe than they expected, but Israel didn't respond that way. They said, we're going to kill you, even at the risk of the hostage's life. They claimed saving the hostages is our number one priority. But behaviorally, killing Hamas is their number one priority.
Clearly.
And getting the hostages out is important, but not to the point they're not going to go after Hamas. That's number one. Right now, there's negotiations going on to try to release some hostages in exchange for a temporary ceasefire. So maybe Hamas proposed 50 hostages in a 5-day ceasefire, and Israel responded, all the hostages for a 3-day ceasefire. So they're in that Middle Eastern haggling pattern. If you've been in the shuk, you know that you have to negotiate. So they're in that process. The challenge is that time is running out for Hamas, time is running out for the hostages. They found the body of a 64-year-old hostage today near this Al-Shifra hospital that Israel is operating around. Most of the hostages are probably in the south of Gaza with the rest of the Palestinian population. One of them was pregnant when she was taken and probably has given birth by now, just by the gestation age that she's at. And we just don't know, what the status of those hostages are. The proper response to hostage taking, I don't think anybody's worked out. If someone hijacked a plane today, what's the right answer? Do you try to invade and risk what they'll do to the hostages? Do you negotiate? Do you trade something? Do you release prisoners? I don't think there's a good answer to it.
Is it your family member or somebody else's family member who's the hostage?
Whose family is hostage? I mean, I've said in other contexts, I think I said when we had our town hall on Monday, that really they should be talking not about 240 hostages, but about 2 million hostages. That is, all the Palestinians in Gaza are hostage to Hamas. And their human shields are being put in front of Hamas. They're hiding behind them as if they were, like a baby they're holding in front of their face. So it's not just the Israelis who are the hostages, it's all of the Palestinians. But what's unfortunately been happening is to kill the hostage takers, a lot of hostages are dying. And, what's the proper proportion? I read one statistic that it was about a quarter of the Palestinian casualties were probably Hamas fighters. So of the 12,000 or so that have been reported, call it 3,000 that are Hamas operatives or activists. Is that the right proportion? 3 civilians to 1 terrorist? Is there a right proportion?
Probably changed after October.
Well, the laws of war say you need to be proportional. You can, if someone's hiding in a civilian area, they are a legitimate military target, but you have to weigh the proportionality of what the benefit you get versus the damage to the civilian setting. And there's no math formula for what the proportion should be to be justified. So I don't have a good answer because I don't think there is a good answer for how many need to die. And the other point, Chet, is that your math is different when they're your hostages versus those people. And Israel, as any country would be, is less concerned about those people than it is about their own people. I mean, how many times did America do this in Iraq, in Afghanistan? We bomb a wedding, we're trying to get the terrorists, and there's collateral damage in that terrible euphemism. Now, collateral damage when it's them is different than when it's us.
I think about how we reacted to 3,000 of our own being killed. This was the equivalent of 50,000 Americans being killed.
Right.
How would we have reacted to that?
Right. Right. Yeah. Any other last thoughts, comments, or questions from those online or here in the room? Instead of going to war immediately, should Israel have done what they did after the Munich Olympics? They did nothing immediately after, then killed everyone involved over the coming several years, not bringing the world's wrath down upon their response. Well, they tried to kill those in charge. Sometimes they killed random Palestinians accidentally and were caught doing it, and it wasn't a good thing. Some of their operatives were arrested for using fake passports, and I mean, it wasn't the success that we imagine it to be. I actually really enjoyed Steven Spielberg's movie Munich, which is about that process and what happened, because it makes some interesting contrast between Jewish values of empathy and Zionist values of fighting back and providing deterrence. It was a really interesting meditation on that process. I don't think we'll ever really know the final math. There's still at least one of the organizers who's still around, living in Algeria or some other North African country. Was it wiser? Maybe. The problem was that Black September was organized by a relatively limited circle of people. You're talking, you had over 1,000 people coming in this invasion, not to mention the planners and the organizers and so on. And some of them are pretty deep in Gaza, and it's going to be tough to find them. And the other difference was that was a terrorist action in Germany with 12 hostage takers, or however many there were. This was an act of war on your border. And that's a very different dynamic, where I don't think they could simply use special ops to solve the problem.
And I don't think the Israeli public would have allowed it.
Right. They wanted a response and a deterrence. And honestly, the secret services are what blew it. They didn't see this coming. So you can't necessarily trust that they're going to get it right in the reprisal either. The Israeli omnipotence of the Mossad and the armed forces is one of their sort of mystiques that goes to their value, to their benefit. But in real life, it's not so perfect. All right. Well, thanks for staying up to explore a bit on the history of Gaza, Israel, and Hamas. Again, I can't leave you on an upbeat note because the world isn't always upbeat. But hopefully, as Israel makes progress, and ultimately, it has to stop at some point, and then we have to talk about what happens afterwards. Hopefully, that what happens afterwards will not include Hamas in any future arrangement. If they have to go into exile, if they have to surrender, whatever happens, they should not be part of a future Gaza. And if that's the case, maybe there is a turning of the corner after the funerals, after the rebuilding, and some kind of reconciliation, maybe a different future, but it's a long ways away.
Yeah. In the same way that I feel so pessimistic about our getting anything accomplished in our country because of the huge divide and extremists even on both sides, but one side in particular that I'm concerned about. I think Israel has the same problem. And so I don't have the same kind of faith that I used to, that they can solve problems in the way that I used to believe they could.
Yeah. Someone online asks, how do you approach someone with nuances when they practice black and white thinking? I mean, one strategy, first of all, you don't do it with strangers, because strangers are never going to concede anything to you, most likely. It's a certain personality that's willing to be generous that way. But if it's someone that you have a relationship with, who's still thinking black and white on the issue, you can start by acknowledging something that you can both agree is true. Look, we both agree that the Israeli settlements in the West Bank are appalling, and the rampaging the settlers are doing there is awful, and there should be a two-state solution that provides. So you start with, here are some things we can agree on. Hopefully.
I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, you can find something to agree on in that direction. And then you can say, here's where I read this differently. I see the situation as Hamas is like a cancer that needs to be cut out. And some people, some prostate cancers don't need to be treated because they're growing so slowly. And as you get older, they grow even slower. But people hear the word cancer and they say, cut it, get it as far away from me as possible. when sometimes the treatment for like you have high blood pressure or you have a weak heart, the surgery is going to be worse than just let the cancer alone, you know? So it's a cost benefit analysis. And if I read the situation and say Hamas needs to be wiped out, and you read the situation and say that's going to just make lots of mini Hamases of all the people who sympathize with them who are now inflamed because of all the violence you've done, we're making a different analysis of the situation, both with the goal of, in the long run, peace and stability. And so that's a way to sort of acknowledge that they have some validity and you have some validity, and maybe that inspires them to see things a little bit differently, because you started by conceding something and saying, you're right, and then here's where I disagree. It's a little bit like when I was in graduate school and they gave me advice for grading papers. They said, even if it's the worst essay you've ever read, start with something nice. Good point. What are you trying to say here? This doesn't make any sense. You always start with something nice. Yeah, right. So you start with something nice, something you can agree on, or something positive, and then they're more receptive to hearing a place where you disagree. If you start with you're wrong about everything, then you're not going to get any.
Although it's tough to do, you have religious fanatics on both sides that are. They have a big say in things.
Well, here's where with the Hamas thing you can say, we in the Jewish side, we have our religious fanatics, these settlers who want to take over the whole land because the Bible told them so, who want to blow up the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. We have our fanatics, absolutely.
There goes the coalition right there by saying that.
Yeah, but what do you really think Hamas is about? Is Hamas a freedom-fighting democratic force? No, it's not. I mean, look, the PA is corrupt and anti-democratic, and they're terrible too. I'm not in favor of them either. But Hamas, they're ISIS. They are the Islamic State. They want to impose an Islam. You're upset about these bans on abortion. You're upset about government money going to fund private religious schools in America. What are you doing supporting Hamas? That's who they are. That's what they want.
Don't know. That's what
I know. So that's where you have to say, what do you actually know about Hamas? Have you ever read the founding charter? What do you think about that? Or so knowledge gives you some authority to be able to say, here's what I know about them. And yes, I know I've heard they do this other stuff, the charity work and the advocacy and so on, and they are fighting for the independence of their people, even if it's at the cost of another people. So I see some of what you're saying, but do you see what I'm saying? The other half of the story. If I'm willing to concede some of the negatives on the Israeli side, are you willing to see some of the negatives on the Hamas side? So that's where, again, the concession to start sometimes open the door to seeing the other side.
And if you have two rational people who are discussing it, trying to sort things out, it's a good way to proceed. You don't know how well it works when you've got fanatics as involved as they are.
Well, look, there was no negotiating with Nazi Germany. I mean, the answer was unconditional surrender. I mean, I almost wish that they had taken that tack going into Gaza, not that we will destroy Hamas. They had said unconditional surrender. That's the price. You surrender, you submit yourself to trial, or you go into exile, and that's it. Like there's no. So then there'd be a price. There'd be an end point, right? Now there's no end point. It's we must destroy Hamas. So what if they flee to Algeria? You're going to go find them? There's no end. They're going to go to Afghanistan and hide out there, but Israel's going to start invading Afghanistan?
I love what you said before, but there's 2 million people who are being held hostage.
Yeah.
Not 240. So those are the kinds of things that need to be said out loud a lot.
Yeah.
And the charter that you put up on the I would love to see selected pieces of that put on TV for Americans to watch. Well, put on MSNBC or CNN where progressives are watching it, including the progressives who are saying that the Israel is, they made this reaction happen. They provoked this terrorist attack. Well, why don't you read what Hamas's charter is?
Well, you could also read the founding document for the Likud party, which also talks about controlling all the territory from the river to the sea.
Yeah.
They just meant from an Israeli perspective.
Yeah.
So you want to take selections, you'll find them.
So, I mean, you do the same thing with the Bible. You can say there's
Yeah, sure.
in the Quran. Yeah, well,
From the-
look,
Yeah, right. Nile to the Euphrates, all given to Abraham.